Hi there and welcome.
You're listening to Animals and Us, Voices of a New Paradigm.
My name is Avantika, and I'm a researcher exploring animal consciousness, environmental sustainability, and planetary health. I want to help bring animal perspectives to the table and transform our relationship with the natural world.
And I'm Barbara. I'm an animal communicator and retired veterinarian. My true passion is exploring the hearts and souls of animals and helping people come to a much deeper understanding of who the animals truly are at their core.
This podcast is for anyone who loves animals and nature and has an interest in their own personal and spiritual development. We'll bring you powerful conversations with fascinating people about animal and nature sentience, consciousness, and communication.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of love, respect, understanding, and care for the fellow beings who share our beautiful Mother Earth with us.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Animals and Us, Voices of a New Paradigm. We're so happy to introduce you all today to Estella Kuchta, who I met a few years ago and really connected with, and I'm sure you'll understand why in this episode. Estella's energy, her values, and her interest align so well with ours. Estella is a researcher, and we'll talk more about her research today. She's also a teacher and a writer. She's written 2 books. The first book was a novel called Finding the Daydreamer, and her second book, which she co-authored, is called Ecologizing Education, Nature-Centered Teaching for Cultural Change, which we'll also talk about today because Estella is an advocate for re-envisioning education, going beyond green schooling programs that are focused on changing behaviors and really looking deeply at our approach to education and anti-ecological features that exist in the system, so much so that we probably don't even realize it. So this is really about creating a paradigm shift in classroom culture where we're more in sync with the more than human world. What's really interesting is that when I met Estella a couple of years ago, I found out that she was doing research on the role of love in intuitive communication with animals and trees and other beings. So her research looked at how love plays a key role in enabling and creating the right environment for interspecies communication, and her focus was on trees specifically. I'm going to actually read this from an abstract that she submitted. She says, "If humans can learn to tune in more to our love and the love that the earth gives to us, that we can become more loving, committed, protective, generous, embodied, and responsible members of Earth." Estella, we're so excited to get into all of this with you and get to know you better, get to know some of the work that you do better. And before we start, a huge congratulations to you for just completing your PhD. So now I'll introduce you differently. Welcome, Dr. Estella Kuchta.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Yes, we're finally doing this. We're finally having this conversation. So start us off, Estella, by telling us how you became interested in interspecies communication and specifically the role that love has to play in that whole experience.
So I've been studying love from a number of different angles for quite a number of years now. I've been a member since 2008 of the International Love Researchers Network, and my master's degree in English literature examined the nature or flavor of love stories in Canada and Canadian fiction from an eco-critical perspective. But an interesting thing happened to me when I was sitting in one of my doctoral classes a few years ago, where the class was specifically on alternative ways of knowing, alternative epistemologies. And I found myself realizing that I actually had ways of knowing, ways of coming to understand the world that we not only didn't discuss during the course of the whole term, but that I also felt embarrassed to bring up. I felt embarrassed to talk about. And yet I know many other people in the world who also have these alternative ways of knowing. So for example, one of my ways of knowing that I've been doing ever since I was a little girl is communicating with trees. I didn't know that that was a thing that we were not supposed to do, or that, was not actually considered a legitimate way of coming to know. And so I had actually quite involved relationships with the trees in my little suburban yard, maple trees. There were some fir trees, but mostly it was the maple trees. That's one example. And so I decided when I was doing my doctoral research that there's actually kind of a large gap in the literature about ways of coming to know that move beyond the material focus that our scientific worlds and largely our academic worlds seem to center around.
Wow, interesting. So, so you said that you felt that you could communicate with trees from a really young age. And last time we spoke, you also told us about how you learned later in life about your Celtic heritage and how there's a deep-rooted connection and reverence for trees. Can you tell us how you came to know about that and how that fits into your sense of things?
Sure. So I'll just take you on a little quick timeline here. So
Yeah.
again, as a very young child, like I don't have a first memory of talking to trees. I just remember I always could. And then I found out I wasn't supposed to, and I gave up that practice for many, many years until I was a young adult. And then I stumbled across a lot of literature about Native American and First Nations culture and their spirituality, and learned that from their perspective, it's actually quite normal to be able to communicate on intuitive ways with trees and wind and rivers and other animals and things like this. So I returned to it at that point. And then at some point when I was doing my doctoral research, I did start thinking about how weird it was that why trees? There was a woman at the symposium we were at a couple of years ago on multi-species methodologies who communicates only with horses. And I asked her the question, why horses? And she said, I have no idea. And I really thought about, well, why trees? I have no idea why I can communicate with trees more easily than I can with animals, even though I've also grown up with dogs and with cats. And been around horses a lot. So I was really interested when I came across a couple of years ago, Diana Beresford Kruger's book, To Speak for the Trees. And Diana Beresford Kruger is a botanist of Irish English descent who lives in Canada. And she goes into a lot of detail in that book about the history of the Irish and Celtic relationship to trees that was so deeply ingrained in the culture. Even their language, Ogham, was based on a relationship with the trees. The letters of the alphabet, she says, were named after trees and in some cases plants. She says that there's actually a word for people who can intuitively communicate with trees in the old Irish Celtic language. It's a really, really long word, and I'm not going to try to repeat it here. I don't know how to pronounce it. But she says that this word means a person who is sort of naturally tuned into the trees. When I read that, a light bulb went off, and I thought it's possible that maybe one of the reasons why I can communicate with trees is because of my own Irish heritage. My grandfather was born and raised right in the area of the world, right in the corner of the world where she did her own research on this. So maybe something got passed down and has been a little bit dormant.
That's so interesting. Thank you for taking us on that journey of how you got to that point. How did how did the role of trees evolve in your research? And where did they come in? And how did you decide to bring them into your work for your PhD?
So I decided to link together this idea of love and alternative ways of knowing, because as I mentioned, I felt like these alternative ways of knowing that I had were very much not discussed, not analyzed, not even in many cases recognized. And when I really thought about them, I realized the common thread between them was love. When I really think about how I communicate with trees, the basis of it appears to be love. And so all these alternative ways of knowing that I have in my life seem in some way or other rooted in love. And the other people that I know in my life, regardless of what gender, also it's rooted in love. And so I thought, well, I have had many experiences in the past, and I discussed them and analyzed them through the course of my doctoral thesis. But is it possible to also move forward with this? What would it look like to go forward? And instead of just looking at experiences that I've had with trees and other beings, alternative ways of knowing and love in the past, if I design an entire experiment moving forward, is this actually going to work? And so what I set out to do is to do a qualitative study, communicating not with humans, but with trees, essentially kind of being involved in like an interview process with trees, the purpose of which would be to find out through the communication, how is love playing a role in these communications? And also, what do trees think about love? What is their experience of love? What are their messages that they want to share about love? So I began this process with that in mind, bumbling, not having any idea how to do it, because of course, nobody's done this before. And when I first started out my process, I really had no idea how to even figure out what tree to talk to. I live in a city, but it happens to be a city that is filled with trees. Even the apartment that I live in looks out onto a park filled with trees. So, how do I even begin? At first, I was bumbling and stumbling along, not having any idea. And over a period of time, I realized actually, no, I do have some idea. By maybe the fourth or fifth session, I realized I did have a subtle sense of being called, of being pulled in a particular direction. And when I began to work with that and analyze it in more detail and figure out how to write about or describe that experience, I realized I was looking for a kind of light. So I was feeling drawn, and when I would arrive at a location where I felt like I was being drawn, I was looking for a kind of light, not light as in color, didn't have anything to do with color, but a kind of radiance that I associate with love. And so if I went to a park, there might be one tree that seemed to be kind of radiant and the others were not. On one occasion, I walked all the way through a forest and down a very, very steep set of stairs down to a river below, and there's trees everywhere. And I was looking around and looking around. I could not figure it out. I mean, there's lights, twinkling off the river, but that wasn't it. And there's light hitting some of the trees, but that wasn't it. It's a different kind of light. Finally, I realized on that particular occasion, it wasn't a tree that I was feeling drawn by. It was a very, very large stone. And so I ended up having a conversation intuitively with the stone on that case.
I love that. Thank you for kind of walking us through how you figured out where you needed to be and which trees were calling you to have the conversation. I've actually, interestingly enough, I've had some really amazing conversations with stones and boulders as well. And at times and it was spontaneous, it wasn't like I was necessarily trying. But it's quite an interesting experience, very different energy than other beings that I've connected with. So that's that's really cool. So tell us how the communication actually starts and how you receive information from the stone, from the trees. So once you know who is kind of calling you or you see this light, you feel it, you gravitate towards a certain tree, what happens then?
I love this question. And just before I answer it, I'm going to clarify something else too, which is I'm describing how it works for me.
Mhm.
And this is from what I understand from talking to a lot of other people who practice intuitive interspecies communication, IIC. This is how it works for a lot of them. But I don't want to, as an academic, present the idea that this is the only way that people might be able to communicate or that my way is the best way.
Mhm.
Because one of the things that does feel clear to me is that people have their own ways of finding their way into this type of communication. So
Right.
that's one caveat I want to put on. And the other one is I also think that sometimes us academics in our extreme enthusiasm to hyperanalyze everything can sometimes end up making things sound much, much more complex or even convoluted than they actually are. And so as I mentioned to you guys in one of our casual conversations recently, I think that sometimes it's so very easy to communicate with trees and other beings that actually the hardest part is just to forget you've been told you can't. That's probably the hardest thing right there, is just forget that you've been told you can't. Even in the book that I was reading last week, the Secret Garden, the characters there all communicate with robins and trees and plants, and it's easy. Ordinary children on very first effort just do it. So with all that preface, how it actually functions for me is I feel I have to shift my state of being, because living in the Western world, in North America, we're such an assertive and action-driven culture that working with IIC, intuitive interspecies communication, I have to shift it the other direction. I have to be in a state of receptivity. I'm not doing, I'm just receiving. I'm just there to sort of receive. And in fact, one of the things that can sometimes help me personally to kind of get into a more receptive state, and this is something that the trees actually told me to think about as a helpful thing, was to feel, am I willing to be loved? And if you guys and your audience right now thinks about that and really feel that, are you willing to be loved? It does shift you into a very receptive state, because doing IIC is not just about loving a tree. It's a two-way thing. It's also about being willing to be loved. And so when I approach a tree that I feel like is communicating or wanting to communicate with me, wanting to call to me, has pulled me toward it, and it might be one tree, it might be several trees, it might be a family or a whole community, then I approach in this very kind of childlike, innocent type of way with just openness and appreciation. I'm thinking about years ago, I met one of my closest friends, Felice, and the very first time I saw her, I thought, oh, there's something really interesting about her, and I want to know who she is. And I felt this appreciation for her and this openness to accept anything about her, whoever she was, right from the beginning. And this is how I feel with the trees too. When I approach them, they're sentient beings to me. I don't need to convince myself of that. I've experienced that my whole life. So they're sentient beings. Each one is different from the other, and they have an open curiosity. And there's, if you were going to translate it into words, maybe the feeling inside me would be a very delighted, grateful, hi, who are you? I'm here for you. Something like that.
That's so beautiful. And it's so unusual in the academic world to talk about love. And it seems like you've made a whole PhD thesis around it, which is kind of incredible. And just, for me, communicating with animals for many years, what I've learned is I see love as the key that opens the door to communication, because it's that feeling of really beautiful love. And it's not love like many in our culture would frame it, romantic love or this kind. It's a very deep, heartful, soulful kind of love. And when you can get to that place, things shift. So that's really beautiful. And I know in our conversation before, you talked about how you asked the trees how you could help other people to communicate with them. And could you talk about what the trees told you?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been surprised on a number of occasions by communications that I've had with the trees. And one of them is when I asked the trees how I might teach other people how to do this. And I was hoping, especially again, as an academic, we like things to be kind of precise. So I was hoping for sort of a 1, 2, 3 step process. And the trees were really clear with me. They said, don't teach it. Instead, create the conditions for people to find their own way into it. So that was an interesting thing. I also had a number of interesting other experiences related to love, care, protection, things like this that were unexpected during the course of my field work. One was at the time when I started my field work, I was actually very, very ill with long COVID. I caught the really very first wave of it long before there were vaccines or anything like that. And I was so incapacitated. The whole first year, I could barely leave my house. The second year, I could only take little 5, maybe 10-minute walks. But as everybody knows, right, a doctoral process is really grueling and demanding, and you have to work exceedingly hard, and you have to, nose to the grindstone kind of attitude. So I'd force myself to go out when I was very tired, and I'd try to sit next to the trees. And from a tree perspective, they were like, what are you doing here? I was like, okay, yeah, but I got to do my qualitative research. So we're going to, do this process. And from a tree perspective, it's like, no, like they just could not understand why I would try to do a thing I didn't actually have the energy to do. That made zero sense from a tree perspective. It forced me to have to take better care of myself because I realized after a few experiences of this, they were just not going to communicate with me at all unless I was actually well rested and actually had the capacity to do this work. So that was one surprising thing. Another surprising thing was, on many other initial, like in the early stages of doing this, many other occasions, I said to the trees, okay, well, I'm here to help you. I'm one of the many human beings who is so concerned about the trees. We're so concerned about the earth, and I'm here to help you. Tell me what I can do to help you. And the energy almost always went the other direction. The trees felt themselves to be there to help and support me. And very often when I would try to offer something to the trees, their response was just, we're fine. We don't need anything. We're just fine. Everything's all right. But you need a lot of help. So let's help you.
So great. Isn't it incredible how compassionate these beings, the trees, the plants, the animals truly are? I mean, we could certainly learn a thing or two from them, couldn't we? Yeah. So was there, I know there are lots of messages, but are there some messages that you can think of that the trees relayed for you to spread to humanity? What do they want us to know?
Absolutely, there are some messages. On session 9, a chestnut tree I was communicating with said, in response to the question, what is their understanding of love, outside of communicating with me? The chestnut said, the soil is a lifelong intimate embrace. Trees are caressed by the light. The soil is a constant connector. It's not possible to be unconnected to others. The trees have a kind of seeing with their leaves that can perceive the beauty around them. The tree accepts humans as part of nature, as belonging to this world, as free to wander. Growth itself is a kind of love. The reaching out, broadening, expanding, lushness, abundance, connection, and touch. And a Douglas fir on session 12 said, there are little medicines everywhere, all day, given to people that are meant to help. Learn to recognize and accept these gifts. And then as my process progressed, I eventually was invited to have an experience that was also unexpected, where one particular Douglas fir tree showed me how to then connect intuitively with the whole forest, which was kind of an amazing experience. And one of the things that was the most surprising about that was how it was kind of a relief, even on a kind of physical level, in a way that it's difficult to articulate, but it gave me a feeling of actually being able to move outside of my own brain into a much more alleviated space. It does remind me a little bit of Sheridan and Longboat's academic article on the Haudenosaunee imagination, where they talk about that Western culture thinks that imagination is something that happens inside the human brain, whereas the Haudenosaunee indigenous people believe that imagination is something that is gifted from more than humans to humans in a kind of shared space. And I'm just going to read you one other little quote here. A white-crowned sparrow, also on session 12, said, "Humans are the most impoverished of animals because of their tendency to hold obstacles and blockages to love." And while we're at it, let's do one from the whole forest. The whole forest, on another session, said, "It is counter to the intention of life, of earth, to block or stop love, though many humans do that."
Wow. That's fascinating and profound.
It was lovely to be part of, as I'm sure you can imagine. Yes.
Yeah. And what I've learned too is that when we get to that level of communication, you're talking about a soul level of communication, I would think. You can communicate with an individual, you can communicate with a whole species, you can communicate with a whole planet. I mean, it's kind of boundless. So that is really beautiful. Yeah, thank you.
I think sometimes in our current culture, we have a rather inverted sense of love, upside down, flipped inside out sense, where even sometimes our self-help books and our therapists that we hire sort of train us to think about love as something that we need to achieve and to go out and find and to work really hard at. And, while, for example, in a friendship or a marriage, there's things that you need to do, there's efforts you need to put in, there's actions you need to take. On a much broader level, going back to your comment, Barbara, on like kind of a spirit level, actually, we are utterly surrounded by love. And I think it would be far more healing for us as human beings suffering skyrocketing rates of mental health problems and as the species responsible for ecological collapse right now to actually embrace this idea that we are surrounded by love. We are already and always loved. If you go spend enough time next to the trees, I don't think you can forget that. Maybe it's just me, maybe it's just my experience, but I don't think that if you spend enough time with trees, you can continue to feel alone or continue to feel that you don't belong or continue to feel that you are unloved. And really, we need to feel that we belong. We need to feel whole. We need to feel accepted and we need to feel loved in order to make the right decisions in the world.
Yes, true. And don't you think that one of the reasons that people have such a hard time receiving this love and accepting it is because of skepticism, because we've been so conditioned to be skeptical of these things. And I'm remembering a story you told us about a friend of yours who was a very great skeptic. But in the end, he realized it wasn't just skepticism that was holding him back. Can you tell that story?
Yes, luckily, the great skeptics in my life have not written me off and continue to talk to me, which is a great blessing for me in a number of ways. One of the things that I can do is talk to the skeptics and then think about how to more carefully articulate what it is that I'm saying so it does feel more inclusive, or the pathway from skepticism to what I'm experiencing feels a little more clear and open. But this one friend of mine who's very, very bright and very self-aware had been a devout skeptic for a long, long time. We'd had many conversations about this. And at one point, he finally said, it's not so much that I don't believe it's possible to communicate with trees and other species. It's that I don't want to. It's too painful. He said in his daily life, he already has the experience of being too much of an empath. to the point where it almost breaks him. It's unbearable in moments how much he feels like he takes on and picks up on just from other human beings. And if he had to also feel what the trees are feeling, the suffering trees, the suffering rivers, the suffering birds, he doesn't think he could bear it.
Wow. Yeah. And I think that's very, very true, that the more sensitive and open you become, it gets harder.
Yeah.
So that's, I would think, maybe you have an answer for that. I don't, but I think spiritual practice and personal growth, where you really, really dive in and look at your own issues and get more clear about who you are and your place in the universe. I think it helps to some degree, but it's still really challenging to be such an empath, don't you think?
I think so, but I don't even feel like I'm as much of an empath as perhaps my friend is. Maybe I'm a little more shut down, at least to human beings, than he is. But at the same time, I feel that there's something so profoundly healing and nurturing in having this openness with trees in my life, so that, now, as a result of having done this doctoral process and gone through this whole huge thing and really developed much, much, much deeper relationships with trees in my own community, I feel it would be impossible to have a feeling that I don't belong or I'm unloved. I mean, sure, we're all going to have moments like that, but what an incredible gift that is. So I feel like the benefits far outweigh the downsides. And, we hear people say this about animals all the time, but it's also true about trees that they're much more dependable than human beings. They're much more reliable. Those of us who do communicate intuitively with trees say about them as sort of a generalization that trees are very, very kind. The spirit of them is very kind. In the same way, you can generalize about dogs and say they're very loyal. You can generalize about trees and say they're very kind.
Oh, that's so wonderful. And if people could really, really, including me, if we could really, really tune into the trees and all the nature beings, I mean, we wouldn't be alone. We wouldn't feel ostracized. We wouldn't feel sad because we've got such amazing love and beauty surrounding us all the time. So
That's
that's really,
exactly right. That's exactly right. And then hopefully from that much, much more healed place, we could make much better, more collaborative, more creative decisions about how we're going to move forward. I know that there are many young people, many of whom come into my classrooms, who are really, truly distraught about the state of the world right now, about climate change and ecological degradation. And understandably so. If you look at the science around it, it's quite undeniable. However, I don't think that all hope is lost. I think far from it, because there are doors we haven't even hardly begun to open, such as actually asking the trees and other beings what they think we should do in order to, shift things the other direction. There's actually a lot of reason for hope and a lot of reason for healing.
yeah. And what if all the young people grew up knowing that? I mean, how different would our world be? It'd be a completely different place, wouldn't it?
It
There wouldn't be
absolutely would be.
wars, there wouldn't be violence, there wouldn't be hatred and bigotry. Yep.
Yes. And, I think one of the things that has really motivated me in all this is pushing for more cognitive diversity. We live in an era where we're really pro diversity and we're pro equal rights in so many ways. Whether we achieve it or not is, of course, a whole nother question. But it's an issue that's very up for people. And yet the issue of cognitive diversity is still a little bit in the backwater in a lot of realms, especially when it comes to this type of intuitive knowing. A lot, and not certainly not all, I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush, but a lot of scientists or people who are very entrenched in a materialistic form of science find it very hard to actually give space to people who have these other ways of knowing. And so I think that is step number one. If we're going to try to think about how to create this more loving, more communicative relationship with our more than humans in the world, is to actually create enough space in our educational institutes so that even children from the earliest ages understand that, this is even possible. They're not just told, oh, you have such a big imagination, when they try to tell their teachers something they heard the tree say, that, the teacher might begin to understand that this child might actually be onto something, might have yet to, learn what the teacher has already learned too well.
Yeah, very true. Very wonderful what you're doing, educating people about love, about receptivity, about imagination, all these things. I certainly never learned it when I was growing up. So it's wonderful that you're doing that. And I've got another question. You've talked about the difference between radiant love and heart love. And I think that's really crucial when we're talking about this love, you know. Could you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. So, one of the areas of complexity in my doctoral research is that I do discuss many different types of love, often love that is overlapping, different overlapping definitions. But I do want to clarify a distinction between two important things. One is what I'm calling the heart love. And I think when we talked about it before, Barbara, you helpfully called it sort of more psychological love. And this might manifest in, say, me looking at a tree and say, oh, it's so gorgeous. I love the tree so much. Look how pretty it is. And oh, and I can sit underneath it and I can smell how nice it is. And it's like, zing, emotions flying, everything else. But when I'm actually communicating with the tree, even though I might feel that love toward it, that love is very backgrounded. I'm not in that heart love space when I'm communicating. Instead, I'm in a space of that I think of as more the radiant light love, the spiritual love, where I can look at a tree and I recognize that it is a being that is living in this world in the same way that I am a being that is living in this world. It is therefore, immediately worthy of respect and understanding, compassion, love, and support. And I can approach it with a kind of honoring in the same way that I might approach somebody who was from a different culture than me, or somebody who is an elder, somebody I really, really respect and want to give space to at the same time I can fully appreciate. And, just sort of say, I'm curious about your being. I'm curious about who you are. And for me personally, because in my process, I go where the trees have called me. I don't do any other kind of formal process that I know some other people who communicate with trees do. I know some other tree experts, who have done amazing, amazing work, like Sarah Abbott and Monica Gagliano with plants. They have kind of ceremonies and things that they do with trees. In my own case, it's more the way I would encounter, say, a brand new friend coming from a foreign country that I'm greeting. Except, of course, the trees are more indigenous than I am. So it's a little bit backward in that way. But there's a sense of honoring and a sense of appreciation it's not worship. I'm not worshiping the trees, but I'm very much have a feeling of honoring their presence, honoring their being. And so it's from that spiritual place of love that I try to approach.
Thank you. That is, you're so clear and so articulate when you describe these things that I've experienced myself, but can't always put into words. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are kind words.
I agree, Estella. You have such a beautiful way of crafting your sentences and explaining things so well. I've just enjoyed listening to you so much. Something you just touched upon right now was this approach to that connection and communication with the tree, and relates to something you briefly talked about a little bit earlier, which was that it's amazing that more and more research is starting to happen on this topic, which is wonderful and very important for many reasons. But you also have talked about the ways that we talk about intuitive interspecies communication in academia can make it sound rare and complex and this grand thing, when in reality, it can be something very different and much simpler and perhaps more natural even. Can you talk a little bit about that balance between those two worlds?
Yeah, it can feel really complicated sometimes to write in an academic sense about things that are so basic and ordinary. Sometimes I think that if people realized how very little I'm doing to communicate with trees, they would probably realize they are already communicating with trees in some capacity, and they could just turn their attention slightly more in that direction. For example, I think that there are a lot of farmers who probably already do this. It doesn't matter what kind of farmers. I'm not just talking about, organic, small, small scale farms or something. But if you really talk to farmers, and some researchers have done this, you find out that they say things that might sound a little like poetic, like, oh, well, this crop told me it wanted to be here this year, or I usually put the cattle out to this pasture, but they all complained and said they wanted to go this way. And we might just think, they're just, using a turn of phrase. But actually, they are feeling and sensing on some intuitive level. Ordinary gardeners experience this too. They'll be maybe about to plant some plant in one place, and then they just have this sense that the plant would rather be in a different location. So I do think that we can run the risk of making things sound much more complicated by putting certain terms on it, by describing certain steps to it. I think even after hearing an episode like this, if most people go out with just a sincere intention to try to be receptive, just receptive to what another tree or plant might want to communicate, they might be very surprised.
Mhm. And we've talked about this before on the podcast as well, that along with that openness to and being receptive, going in with a sense of curiosity and versus, expectations, and also going in with a lot of gratitude. And those things can also help to just set the tone and create the space for that kind of connection to happen. And certainly, like Barbara said, I really hope one day in the future that our kids grow up like this, knowing this and understanding this, and it's just very natural for them to share what they receive. Because I imagine at that age, they're so open. They haven't gotten all that conditioning that we have as adults that kind of keep all the conditioning that keeps us in these constrained environments. So given your research and given your experiences and your beliefs and your values, what is your vision for the future of education? I know that's a big part of the work that you're doing. How can love and ecological awareness be integrated into our educational systems?
So it's a really big question, which
Yeah.
I'm probably too excited to talk about. I'm going to try to make my answer a little shorter than my inclination. But as you know, I've co-authored a book with Sean Blankensop, Ecologizing Education, where we talk at length about re-envisioning an entire educational model that would be much more earth-centered, much more nature-centered rather than human-centric. And within the book, we identify sort of the unseen, invisible biases that underscore all of our contemporary education. And they underscore it in ways where even really open-minded, hardworking, very tuned in educators, and I hope I'm in that category myself, find themselves up against obstacles at every level, so that it becomes extremely difficult to carry out the practices that you feel are right for the students. So my hope is that more people will begin to be tuned into some of the underlying invisible values that are undermining our capacity to create truly nurturing relationships between students and the natural environment. And once we can begin to do that, maybe we can raise the next generation of children with this idea that the earth is actually loving, caring, supportive. It's about belonging. It's not possible to not belong. Everybody has a role, everybody has a part. We are all of us together connected on some level. And so if we can start to do that, then I think we'll find that it's a lot easier for children to express some of their natural gifts. The young girl who can communicate with horses, the little boy who can communicate with lizards, the person who always has the sense of what the weather is about to do, even 2 weeks away. And I think if more of us can be allowed the space to bring the gifts that we have into the world, it will be much easier not only to feel better as human beings in this challenging place, but to do better toward the earth, to think more creatively, to actually, I'm going to use this word tentatively because it's kind of loaded, to evolve toward the loving beings that I think humans are designed to actually be.
I love that. I love that so much. As you're saying this, I'm thinking in my head, with all the traditions and all the norms and all the things we take for granted, things that have been happening for decades in the education system, which looks different in all places, but they're so deeply ingrained, and it sounds like a really big job to create this paradigm shift in the educational system. But I can't help but also think how needed it is and how important it is to, at the very least, start moving in that direction. You're presenting soon at the European Council for Educational Research. Tell us, who will you be presenting to and who's going to be there, and what messages are you hoping to take there and convey in your upcoming presentations?
I am excited about this upcoming presentation. Yeah, so this is the largest educational conference. It happens in Europe annually. And this year it happens that it's going to be in Cyprus in August. And I'm going to be talking about the epistemological possibilities of eco-love. So just to break down that.
Yeah, thank you. I was like,
Yeah.
can you tell our audience in English?
Yeah.
Please.
So basically, what are the possibilities about how we might be able to come to know in other ways, in additional ways, if we actually create more space for what I'm calling eco love? And eco love is just a way of signaling that I'm not talking about a human defined experience of love. I'm talking about love on a much broader scale than that. That includes human beings. And so, this sense of communicating intuitively with trees, other people's work communicating intuitively with animals, but also something that Chris Beeman and Sean Blankensop have talked about with certain Indigenous individuals back east here in Canada, of this meander knowing, which might be akin to my own experience of feeling called to particular trees on particular occasions. But it's this sense that if you stand outdoors in the beginning of your day, you have a feeling of where you are meant to go on that day. The land itself will guide you. Also, there are ways that we might begin to know by having dreams. I'm one of those people who has had, I feel like I've had dreams gifted to me. A dream came to me from another species. In one case, an octopus, and other cases, some water or something else. And the dreams sort of impart a message. Now, none of these things make sense at all. And the skeptic's ears are flaring when we think about them from the perspective of a worldview that is defined by our material selves. Okay? But this is a fallacy, even from the perspective of science, because as we know, we can't really even explain why the table that's holding up my laptop continues to be a table, while meanwhile there are atoms pouring out of it and pouring into it all the time. Even from a scientific perspective, the notion of materiality is rather an illusion, an extremely elaborate, convincing illusion. but it's a little bit of an illusion. So there are a number of different angles you can approach this from, but basically when we look at the world from, a less than material focus perspective, we can see there's a lot of possibilities for how we might come to know through loving and through being loved.
Wow. Is the word eco-love actually used by people, or did you just make that up?
I just made that up.
I love it. That's
So
very
now
good.
when we hear it somewhere else, we'll know where it started, where it all started.
That's so great. And it relates to that radiant, luminous love that you've spoken about too, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Actually, I have a paper in process right now that is entirely about defining the term eco-love. So, cross fingers that that will be accepted and published at some point in the next 12 or so months.
You know, this podcast is called Animals and Dust, Voices of a New Paradigm. And that's what you're all about. You're creating a whole new paradigm in the education system, which is phenomenal. So, in addition to the book you've just described, you have another book. Could you briefly talk about that book?
Sure. So before I began my doctoral research, I finished a master's degree in literature. My goal with that particular research project was to try to look and see, what is a classic Canadian love story? We know a lot about love stories, that are Victorian love stories or traditional Chinese love stories or Russian love stories or even, Southern American love stories. But what is a classic Canadian love story? My investigations into that led me to conclusions that once I found them out, nobody wanted to hear about them, such as that actually the state of love in Canada is not that great. So I decided to write my own novel and see if I could create a love story. Could I actually write a fictional story that was deeply embedded in love? And readers can decide for themselves whether I succeeded. But the love within that story, I was approaching from an eco-critical perspective. So one of the things I had noticed in all of the literature review that I had done in Canadian literature was that, and it's hard to explain this, but where there's more nature in a novel, there is more love. Where there's less nature, there is less love, and it is an incredibly consistent scale. Even two characters who are not very loving toward each other and they live in the city, then suddenly they go for a walk in a very natural park or by the seaside, and now they feel love for each other, and they didn't before, and they go back indoors and it's over again. And so it's, there are some exceptions, but by and large, it's an incredibly consistent phenomena. So, in the course of this novel, I also engage the main character with a lot of nature. She does also have a very strong intuitive sense, and she is also able, in her own ways, without calling it the formal I see, she is in her own ways able to tune into the natural spaces that she is in to connect with other animals and with places and feel intuitively things she wouldn't otherwise be able to know.
Wowie, that sounds like a great book. I think I need to read it. Yeah, thank you.
Would love it if you do.
Yeah. So, how can people find you?
I do have a website, which is just my name, estellakuchta.com. And in fact, even if you just Google Estella Kuchta, you're going to find my webpage. So that's probably the easiest way. And I do have a contact page there too. It sometimes takes me a couple days to get back to people, but I do have a contact page there too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Estella. This has been a pleasure and an honor to be with you. I just am so excited about you and your work and the way you describe things. It's just so elegant. And I really, really appreciate that. And it gives me a lot of hope for the future. If our young people could learn part of what you're saying, it would make such an enormous difference in the world. And the educators and everyone. And if we could really, really learn to talk to the trees, oh my gosh, wouldn't that be a great gift for everyone? So thank you so much.
Well, thank you to you guys for holding this really important space where people can come and tune in and listen to interesting things that your guests talk about. So I really appreciate that you invited me today. Thank you.
You're very welcome. The pleasure is all ours. One of the things that I always think about is in this space and just in general in life, how important it is for each person to really follow their own unique interests and things that they feel they gravitate to naturally. And I'm just thinking how wonderful it was that you kind of followed the breadcrumbs in your life and from one thing to the next, and that you followed your heart and ended up researching this and studying this and being able to share this with the world in the ways that you have, because it's just so beautiful and so different and such an important way to look at the world and something to be aware of. So thank you for following that from all of us who are listening and who participated in this. Thanks for following your heart and letting it guide your journey here, because it's really cool, all the work that you've done. I'm just really excited to see how the future of education unfolds and how the paradigm shift in that whole world and that entire field evolves. And I feel hopeful with the research and the work that you're doing that people will start to pay attention to this work. And so just thank you so much for all that you've shared today. So many beautiful words of wisdom from yourself, from the trees. And I'm really hoping and I'm confident that our audience has really enjoyed this conversation. And before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Maybe just, I think you touched on a really important thing just there, Avantika, when you acknowledged how I went out and kind of did my own thing. And I think that's such an important message to pass along to people. I don't want anybody to feel like they have to do what I did or imitate me or even follow in my footsteps in any way. I think we all have gifts and we all take our own path. And if we can do so authentically, then everyone is so much richer for it.
Yeah, and if we can do it with authenticity and with the guidance of the natural world, then I think that's a really winning and beautiful combination. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you everyone for tuning into this episode today. And before we wrap up, we would like to share a blessing for the animals. And as we hear this blessing today, we'll also keep in mind and think about all the trees and plant beings that bring so much joy and love into our lives.
We'd like to end this podcast by taking just a moment to be quiet. And we give thanks and blessings to these amazing animals that we share our lives with. They give us so much and ask for so little in return. We hope that you can keep the animals and all living beings in your heart and in your mind as you go about your day. Thank you so much for being here with us today.